the spark of war. The Vaynar Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries and believed themselves to be the masters of every world they touched. Their fleets were vast, their weapons unmatched, and their arrogance greater than any empire before them. They looked at Earth from afar and saw nothing more than a small blue world circling a yellow star. They saw humans as a young species reckless and divided easy prey for their expanding dominion. To the Vaynar, the conquest of Earth would be a demonstration to the galaxy of their strength. High above the galactic council chambers, the Vaynar warlord Kareth stood before his generals. His scaled skin shimmered with pride as he spread his claws over the star map. Earth is unprotected, he declared. Their fleets are nothing compared to ours. Their armies will crumble in days. The council murmured approval and plans were drawn to send a fleet to claim the planet as a colony. It was not a war of survival for the Vaynar, but a war of convenience and pride. They wanted a quick victory, a trophy to hang above their halls. Far away on Earth, humanity was unaware of the shadow descending from the stars. Life went on as usual. People worked in their offices, children played in their neighborhoods, armies trained, but no one expected that an alien armada was moving toward them. Yet the first sign came when telescopes picked up strange readings, then when orbital defense stations spotted ships entering the system. At first there was disbelief. Many leaders thought it was some kind of error. But as the images became clear, fear spread quickly across every nation. The United Nations called for an emergency assembly. Never before had the world's governments gathered with such urgency. In the Great Hall, voices clashed. Some leaders spoke of surrender, believing humanity had no chance. Others demanded resistance, arguing that even if defeat came, humanity must fight to the last breath. In the middle of the chaos, one voice rose clear and strong. General Marcus Hale, a veteran with iron eyes, said, "If they come for our world, then they will learn who we are." He spoke with the weight of history, reminding them that humans had always stood tall against impossible odds. The first Vaynar fleet entered orbit, like shadows blotting out the stars. Their ships were massive triangular constructs built for intimidation and destruction. They broadcast a single message across all human channels. This world belongs to the Vaynar Dominion. Surrender, and live, resist, and be erased. The words echoed across Earth, shaking billions of hearts. Yet instead of silence, humanity answered with defiance. Cities went dark to hide from bombardment. Armies mobilized. Scientists began working day and night to turn every resource into weapons. Humanity was afraid but not broken. In the Vaynar command ship, Warlord Kareth watched as human nations prepared for battle. He laughed, amused by their desperate activity. "They do not understand," he sneered. "They think resistance matters, but they are children fighting giants." His fleet prepared for the first strike, confident that victory was only moments away. But he did not know that humans were not like any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. For while the Vaynar relied on power and intimidation, humanity had something far more dangerous: the will to endure and the refusal to bow, and so the spark of war was lit. The skies above Earth would soon burn with fire, and the galaxy would soon learn a truth that no empire had ever dared to test before. You only go to war with humans once. Humanity's first response. The invasion had begun. The Vaynar ships loomed in orbit like great predators circling their prey, and across the surface of Earth, sirens howled, people rushed into shelter, soldiers filled their barracks, and government sent orders that echoed through every channel. It was chaos, but within that chaos there was also unity. A spark that had not been seen before in human history began to burn. Nations that had once argued and mistrusted one another now found themselves side by side against a common enemy. General Marcus Hale stood at the command center of Earth's defense headquarters. His eyes scanned the endless streams of data pouring in from satellites and observatories. He could see the size of the Vaynar fleet, and he knew that every human leader staring at the same images understood the same truth. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Yet Hale did not let despair show. Instead, he spoke with a steady voice to the council of leaders assembled before him. "We cannot outmatch their firepower," he said, "but we can outthink them. Humanity has always won, not because we are the strongest, but because we adapt faster than anyone else. The scientists, in laboratories across Earth, worked without sleep. They studied the alien transmissions, broke down the signals, and searched for weaknesses in their technology. Engineers began rewriting codes to jam enemy communications. Hackers, both state-sanctioned, and rogue, volunteered to breach alien systems through any frequency they could touch. Factories that once built cars and planes were converted to build weapons, drones, and armored suits. Within days, humanity shifted from confusion to determination. This was no longer a question of whether they could win. It was a question of how long they could hold out until they found a way to strike back. The first battle came when a formation of Venar warships descended toward the North American continent. Their weapons lit up the sky as they targeted communication hubs and power grids. Cities trembled under the impact of their firepower, but humanity answered with everything it had. Missile silos that had been silent for decades roared to life. Anti-aircraft cannons fired until their barrels overheated, and squadrons of fighter jets streaked upward like swarms of angry insects. The human pilots knew they could not match alien technology, but they flew with a courage that shook even the enemy. Commanders who watched from their ships, in the chaos of battle. One pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Whitaker, locked her sights on a Venar cruiser. She knew her weapons could not penetrate its shields, but instead of retreating, she dove closer, guiding her jet until she was almost scraping against the alien hull. Then, with a final burst, she released her entire payload, not to break through, but to overload the shield matrix. The cruiser faltered, its systems sparking, and in that moment, dozens of other pilots swarmed it, finishing the kill. The explosion lit the sky, and for the first time humanity saw that the invaders could bleed. The news spread like wildfire across the globe. The Venar had been struck down by human hands. It did not matter that the victory was small compared to the size of the enemy fleet. What mattered was that humanity now knew the war could be fought. The people cheered, the soldiers roared, and even the most doubtful leaders felt hope take root in their hearts. But in the Venar flagship warlord, Kareth's expression twisted in anger. He had expected fear, submission, and despair. Instead, he saw defiance, stubbornness, and strategy. He turned to his generals and snarled, "Crush them harder. Do not give them a moment to breathe." His fleet prepared for the next assault, ready to rain devastation until humanity broke. But Kareth could not see the truth forming beneath his arrogance. Humanity was no longer thinking about survival alone. They were already planning how to fight back. The first response of humanity was not surrender. It was resistance, fierce, unyielding, and unpredictable. The war that was meant to be an easy conquest had become something far more dangerous, for the Venar were about to discover that once humanity stood together, there was no force in the galaxy that could bend them. The turning point. The war that the Venar had expected to be over in a matter of days dragged onward, and humanity refused to fall. What began as frantic defense soon shifted into something else, for humans did not only react, they learned. They studied every ship that fell from the sky, every fragment of alien metal that struck the ground, every scrambled signal that reached their computers. What the Venar called primitive humanity turned into lessons, tools, and weapons. It was not the size of Earth's armies that changed the balance. It was the speed at which they adapted. General Marcus Hale saw it clearly as reports flowed in from across the continents. The losses were heavy, cities burned, and millions were displaced. Yet new strategies were being born daily. Soldiers no longer fought in neat lines. Instead, they struck from shadows and vanished. Guerrilla warfare became the soul of Earth's resistance. Fighter squadrons did not attempt to match alien warships in direct combat. They lured them into storms, used mountain ranges to mask their approach, and crashed unmanned drones into their hulls like swarms of mechanical hornets. Even the simplest of weapons, when guided by cunning hands, began to carve scars across the Venar fleet. In one battle above the Atlantic, a small team of engineers managed to break through the coating of an abandoned Venar probe. They turned it against its own fleet, sending false data streams that convinced the aliens of phantom fleets approaching from behind. The Venar ships split their formation to intercept ghosts, and in that confusion, human submarines rose from the ocean, launching missiles into their exposed flanks. When the smoke cleared, the humans had destroyed 2 cruisers with machines that had once been meant to enslave them. Stories of defiance spread faster than fear. Families hiding in basements listened to radio stations that told of soldiers holding lines against impossible odds. Civilians turned factories into armories, neighborhoods into watchposts, hackers into warriors. Humanity was bleeding, but it was not bowing. And the more the Vanar pressed, the more they found themselves facing an enemy that did not follow the patterns of war they knew. Warlord Kareth grew restless as his commanders argued among themselves. They could not understand why humans were not breaking. In the council chambers of the flagship, some called for orbital bombardment. To erase entire cities, others demanded they withdraw to regroup. But Kareth silenced them with rage. He would not allow retreat. He would not admit weakness. Yet even as he shouted at his generals, doubt began to eat at the Dominion's ranks, for soldiers whispered of humans who fought with fire in their eyes even when outnumbered 10-1. On the ground, soldiers like Lieutenant Sarah Whitaker became symbols of defiance. Pilots painted the names of fallen comrades on their wings before flying into battle, knowing they might not return. Infantry shared rations with starving civilians and swore that as long as they breathed, no invader would touch their soil. In every act, there was grief and pain, but also a strength that no calculation could measure. The Vanar had thought war was only about numbers of ships and strength of weapons, but humanity was showing them another truth. War was also about will. It was about the refusal to surrender when surrender seemed certain. It was about standing together even when everything else was falling apart. This realization began to spread across the Dominion like a sickness, and for the first time in generations, the Vanar Empire felt the chill of fear. The turning point was not a single battle or a single victory. It was the slow, steady realization that humanity could not be broken in the ways the Vanar had mastered. The war had ceased to be a conquest. It had become a lesson, one written in fire and blood, a lesson the galaxy would never forget. Death World Advantage. The Vanar had believed that once they captured human prisoners, the war would shift in their favor. They thought that by showing the suffering of captured soldiers and civilians, they would crush the spirit of resistance. Yet what they discovered inside their prison ships was something that unsettled even their hardened commanders. For the humans did not weep as expected. They did not beg or surrender. Instead, they looked at their captors with unflinching eyes and spoke words the translators could barely render. "We will endure and we will return." On the cold metal floors of the Vanar detention blocks, men and women whispered to each other, not in despair but in encouragement. They sang songs in the darkness. They told stories of Earth's long history of struggle and survival, and they reminded one another that their planet was a death world where every generation had already been forged by hardship. The guards began to notice that the humans resisted, even in silence, refusing to give information or show fear. More than once, alien soldiers had to leave the cells unsettled by the way the prisoners smiled at them. Even in chains, scientists within the Vanar fleets examined human biology, expecting weakness. Instead, they found resilience beyond reason. Diseases that would devastate other species barely slowed humans. Venoms and toxins that crippled most creatures were survived by human immune systems. Injuries that should have killed left them, scarred but still alive. Medical officers began to report with unease that the human body was designed to endure what most would not, and that their minds were just as unyielding. One surgeon wrote in her log that the human is not built to surrender. It is built to adapt. This realization began to ripple through the enemy ranks. Rumors spread that Earth itself was not a gentle cradle of life, but a battlefield of storms, quakes, predators, and diseases. That humans had risen not in comfort, but in struggle, that they were born fighting their own world long before they ever saw the stars. Such whispers reached even the soldiers on the front lines, and with every passing day, fear grew that they had provoked something far more dangerous than they could control. Meanwhile, on Earth, the resistance drew strength from their knowledge of the land. Soldiers lured Vanar patrols into swamps where machines sank into the mud and never returned. Others used freezing mountains where the cold disabled alien armor, but humans marched on with determination. Desert winds blinded the invaders, but not the defenders who had lived under such skies all their lives. In every terrain that the aliens thought hostile, humanity thrived and used it as a weapon. Earth itself seemed to rise in defense of its children. General Marcus Hale and his commanders recognized the advantage and began to craft strategies not around alien strengths, but around human resilience. They turned every environment into a battlefield, tailored for human survival and alien weakness. They knew they could not win by brute force, so they chose instead to exhaust the invaders, to bleed them slowly with endless traps, raids, and counterstrikes. They used not only weapons but the very nature of Earth to fight. Warlord. Kareth grew furious as reports continued to arrive. His fleets destroyed cities yet out of the rubble. More fighters rose. His soldiers captured humans, yet they returned more terrified of their captives than proud of their victory. He stood upon the bridge of his flagship staring at the planet below, and for the first time he did not see a prize to be claimed. He saw a world that devoured arrogance and gave birth to something indestructible. The Venar had walked willingly into the embrace of a death world and awoken a species that had survived everything it had thrown at them. Humanity was no longer merely defending. They were teaching a lesson that no empire in the galaxy could forget. The lesson was simple: that Earth was not weak, and that those who dared to challenge it would find themselves crushed not only by its people but by the very world itself. Humanity strikes back. The moment finally came when humanity stopped being only defenders and turned into attackers. The months of resistance had taught them how the Venar fleets moved, how their weapons charged, and even where their ships were most vulnerable. Every fragment of wreckage, every decoded signal had become fuel for a growing strategy. Now the generals of Earth no longer spoke only of survival. They spoke of counterstrike. General Marcus Hale stood before a vast digital map of Earth's orbit, where the Venar armada still held superiority. Around him gathered military leaders, scientists, and soldiers. They had worked in secrecy, building new weapons from both human ingenuity and alien technology, cannibalized from fallen ships, plasma shields welded to human craft, railguns adapted from mining equipment, hacking, programs designed by underground networks of coders. It was not elegant, but it was deadly. Hale looked at the faces around him and spoke words that resonated through the entire chamber. It is time to show them what humanity can do. The plan began. With deception, small fleets of unmanned drones were launched into space carrying transmitters that mimicked the signals of human squadrons. The Venar sensors lit up with hundreds of false targets, and their warships broke formation to intercept the ghosts. In that confusion, real human fighters emerged from the shadow of Earth's moon, streaking forward like arrows of fire. They aimed not at the strongest warships, but at the vulnerable carriers and supply vessels that kept the enemy fed and fueled. Lieutenant Sarah Whitaker led one of the squadrons. Her jet was patched together from dozens of parts, yet it carried a weapon that no Venar commander had anticipated, a railgun stripped from a mining colony and fitted to her craft. She dove straight toward a massive carrier and at the last second fired a single round. The shot punched through the shields, tearing a hole in the hull and igniting explosions across its decks. As the carrier burned, human cheers erupted across every communication line, for the first great kill of the counteroffensive was theirs. But the battle was not won by weapons alone. It was won by the sacrifices of countless men and women. Soldiers volunteered for missions knowing they would not return. Commandos infiltrated enemy landing zones armed only with explosives to sabotage reactors. Submarines crept into alien harbors on occupied coasts, unleashing missile storms before vanishing into the sea. Each action carried a cost, yet each cost was paid with grim determination, for humanity had decided that freedom was worth more than life itself. The Venar command reeled at the sudden shift. They had never faced an enemy that turned desperation into advantage. Their fleets, once untouchable, now seemed vulnerable, and their morale began to crack. For every ship destroyed by humans, 100 stories of bravery spread across Earth, and those stories burned brighter than any alien bombardment. Warlord Kareth ordered retaliation with fury. But even as his ships struck harder, the humans struck smarter. In one decisive engagement near the asteroid belt, human forces unleashed a trap of staggering scale. Miners had fitted the rocks with thrusters and explosives, turning them into drifting weapons. When the Venar fleet entered the belt, the asteroids ignited, moving in coordinated waves, smashing into hulls, tearing Apart formations, it was a battlefield sculpted by human hands, and the aliens found themselves crushed by the very stones they had once dismissed as useless debris. When the battle ended, and the wrecks of Vanar warships floated in silence, humanity realized that they had done more than survive. They had taken the fight into the void and forced the invaders to bleed in ways they had never bled before. Hope spread across the planet, not as a whisper, but as a roar. Humanity was not waiting for the end anymore, humanity was creating it. The counterstrike had begun, and from that day forward the Vanar no longer saw Earth as prey. They saw it as a predator rising from the shadows with claws of iron and a spirit unbroken. They had thought the war was theirs to win, but now the galaxy would watch as the hunters became the hunted. The lesson in blood. The war was no longer just a contest of weapons. It had become a struggle of spirit, and the Vanar were losing that struggle with every passing day. Their fleets were mighty, but their hearts were faltering. Every report from Earth carried tales of human defiance that unsettled soldiers who had never before tasted fear. They spoke of pilots who fought until their ships became fire. They spoke of soldiers who fought even after losing limbs. They spoke of civilians who stood in the path of invaders armed with nothing but courage. The Dominion that had conquered countless worlds began to question if this world was worth the cost inside. The Great War Council of the Vanar arguments erupted. Commanders called for retreat while others demanded total annihilation, but none could ignore the truth. Their empire was bleeding faster than it could recover. Supplies were dwindling. Rebellions stirred in outlying colonies, and whispers spread that the humans were not only resisting, but inspiring others. Kareth raged at his advisors, his claws slamming against the table. Yet even his roar could not silence the rising fear among his people. For the first time, the Dominion faced an enemy that did not just resist but expose their weakness to the galaxy on Earth. The tide of war shifted further as humanity pressed its advantage. Armies that had once fought only in defense now marched into territories the Vanar had tried to claim. Commanders launched daring assaults against orbital platforms. Engineers hacked deep into alien systems to cripple fleets before they could fire. Doctors and medics worked around the clock, turning basements into hospitals and saving lives with impossible determination. In every corner of the planet, humanity was proving that strength did not only come from weapons, but from unity and sacrifice. One moment stood out as the symbol of this new age. A small human task force discovered a Vanar city ship orbiting above Africa, where thousands of alien civilians had been abandoned by their military commanders to conserve resources. The humans did not fire upon them. Instead, they sent aid, food and medicine, and even broadcast messages of peace. The gesture spread across the galaxy faster than any fleet. It showed that even in war, humanity carried not only fury, but mercy. And while the Vanar leaders mocked it as weakness, their soldiers whispered of it with reverence, for they saw in humans something their own empire had long forgotten. Warlord Kareth could not stop the erosion of his forces. He ordered more ships to the front, but fewer answered the call. He demanded obedience, but his captains hesitated. The blood of the Dominion spilled across the stars, and still humanity advanced. Humanity, who had been seen as primitive, now dictated the tempo of war. Battles once decided by sheer firepower now turned on cunning traps and the unyielding will of men and women who refused to surrender. Every Vanar casualty was not just a loss of numbers, but a lesson written in blood that their dominion was not invincible. As the 6th month of the war dawned, even neutral species across the galaxy began to take notice. They had once feared the Dominion and bent their knees to its rule, but now they watched with awe as humans defied them. Some whispered that the age of the Vanar was ending and that a new power was rising, one that did not rule through terror, but through resilience and unshakable spirit. Humanity was not yet a galactic empire, but it was becoming a legend. The war had shown the Vanar many things, but above all, it had shown them that they had made the gravest mistake any conqueror could make. They had thought they were teaching humans about fear. Instead, it was humanity teaching them a lesson, written not in diplomacy or negotiation, but in fire, in sacrifice, and in blood. The lesson was clear. You only go to war with humans once. The war ends. The legend begins. The final days of the war came not with silence but with thunder. Humanity had driven the Venar from orbit, and now their fleets hunted the remnants of the invaders across the system. Battles raged among asteroids and near the moons of distant planets. The Venar had once arrived with arrogance and overwhelming power, but now they fled with desperation. Their empire stretched too thin, their soldiers too shaken, and their will broken. Humanity pressed forward not because they wanted conquest, but because they knew the war had to end completely, or it would never end at all. General Marcus Hale stood at the center of the command hub, his face weary but his voice steady. He had carried the weight of Earth's survival upon his shoulders, and now he saw victory within reach. Around him, officers and soldiers watched screens that showed enemy fleets collapsing, their formations breaking apart. Hale gave the order to push forward with everything they had, and in that moment, every ship, every fighter, and every soldier moved as one. Humanity was united in purpose, and the stars themselves seemed to echo with their resolve. On the ground across Earth, the scars of war were everywhere. Cities lay in ruins, families mourned their dead, but the spirit of the people had only grown stronger. Where once nations had stood apart, they now stood together, rebuilding side by side. Every person understood that they had fought not only for survival, but for a future where their children would never kneel to an empire that believed in chains. The war had given them pain, but it had also given them unity, and that unity would not be forgotten. A final decisive battle was fought near the orbit of Mars, where the last major Venar fleet had gathered to regroup. They believed distance from Earth would give them strength, but humanity pursued them relentlessly. For days, the battle raged, ships weaving between burning wreckage, asteroids turned into weapons, and fighters diving into impossible maneuvers. At last, the flagship of Warlord Kareth stood alone, surrounded on every side. His commanders pleaded for surrender, but his pride would not allow it. He roared that the Dominion would rise again, but his words carried no power anymore, for even his soldiers no longer believed. Human forces struck in unison, railguns shredding the shields, hacking programs, tearing apart systems, until at last the flagship broke apart in a storm of fire. The death of Kareth echoed through the fleet, and what remained of the Dominion scattered, fleeing into the depths of space. Humanity had not only survived, it had won. When the news reached Earth, cheers erupted across every city, bells rang, crowds wept, soldiers embraced, for they had faced extinction and instead found victory. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. The Dominion that had ruled for centuries had been humbled by a world they thought too weak to matter. And in that silence, a new legend was born, a legend that spread from star to star, carried in whispers by traitors, refugees, and even enemy deserters. You only go to war with humans once. In the aftermath, humanity did not claim thrones or demand tribute. Instead, they rebuilt their homes, they buried their dead. They reached out to the alien civilians who had been abandoned by the Dominion, offering help instead of chains. The galaxy saw mercy where it expected vengeance, and strength where it expected weakness. Humanity had shown that it could fight with unmatched fury, yet also heal with compassion. That balance became the foundation of a reputation far more powerful than any fleet. The reputation of a species that would never bow and never break. The war ended, but the memory would endure forever. For the Venar, it was a scar for the galaxy. It was a warning, and for humanity, it was the birth of something greater than victory. It was the birth of unity, of respect, and of legend. A legend written in fireblood and unyielding spirit. A legend that would remind every empire across the stars that war with humanity is fought only once. The legacy of the war that began with arrogance, ended with silence among the stars. The fleets of the Venar that once darkened the skies of Earth had been scattered and broken their proud empire. Reduced to whispers of fear and regret, humanity stood amidst the ashes, scarred yet unyielding, and in their eyes there burned not only the light of victory, but the weight of memory. They had not fought to conquer. They had fought to survive, and in surviving they had become something the galaxy could no longer ignore. Across Earth, the ruins of cities were filled with the sound of rebuilding. Children played in streets once marked by fire, while soldiers who had stood in the front lines laid down their weapons, and returned to families who thought they would never see them again. The nations that had once been divided now worked as one, for they had discovered that their strength was not in their numbers or weapons, but in their unity. It was this unity that had broken the invaders, and it was this unity that would carry humanity into the stars not as prey, but as equals to any empire. The galaxy watched with caution and awe. Many species who had once feared the Dominion now whispered the name of Earth with reverence. They spoke of a world born in storms where life fought tooth and claw to survive. They spoke of a people who turned every weakness into a weapon, every loss into a reason to fight harder. They spoke of mercy shown, even to those who came as enemies, and of strength that refused to bend. Humanity had not sought to teach, but they had taught the oldest lesson of war, that to fight them was to invite ruin, among the remnants of the Dominion, scattered across distant world. Soldiers told stories in hushed voices of the humans who had stared down death and smiled. They remembered comrades who refused to march into battle again, for they had seen that Earth could not be broken and that no throne could stand firm. Against such defiance, in this way the Dominion was not only defeated by weapons but by belief itself. For belief spread faster than fleets, and belief was what humanity had conquered. General Marcus Hale, who had carried the burden of command, looked out at the night sky one last time. He knew victory was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of responsibility. Humanity was no longer hidden. Humanity was no longer underestimated. Their place in the galaxy was sealed, not by ambition, but by survival. He whispered words to himself that carried across generations. We are human, and that is enough. And so the story of the war ended not as a tale of conquest, but as a warning to all who might forget it. The warning that Earth was not a world to be taken, the warning that humanity was not a species to be enslaved, the warning that you only go to war with humans. Once, the end.